My mother-in-law accused me in front of everyone. You used my son for money. It hurt her, of course it did, but the way she said it, so certain, so rehearsed, left me with a feeling I couldn't ignore. A few days later, when the bank asked to speak with me about something unusual, I realized there was a lot more going on than her words suggested. And that's when everything started to unravel. Hi, I'm Bailey Sarian, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for weeks now. You know how sometimes people say things that just stick to you, like they've been dipped in honey and pressed right into your chest? That's what happened when my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and accused me of using her son for money. I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, but I was wrong. It happened at David's birthday dinner, right there in front of his whole family. We were sitting around that big oak table his grandmother left them, and I was actually feeling good for once. David had just gotten his promotion, we'd finally saved enough for a down payment, and I was thinking maybe, just maybe, Linda would see that I wasn't the gold digger she'd always believed I was. Then she opened her mouth. You used my son for money, she said, cutting through the conversations like a knife through butter. The whole table went quiet, forks suspended mid-air, everyone staring at me like I'd just confessed to murder. My face burned so hot I thought I might spontaneously combust right there in my chair. David's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight, but the damage was already done. What hurt most wasn't just the accusation, it was how rehearsed it sounded. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd been working 2 jobs since we got married, that I'd never asked David for a single dollar I hadn't earned myself. But something about the way Linda delivered those words made my throat close up. She said it with such confidence, such absolute certainty, like she had evidence I didn't know about. The whole room felt smaller suddenly, and I found myself wondering what she thought she knew. David stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Mom, that's enough, he said, his voice tight with anger I'd rarely heard before. But Linda just sat there, arms crossed, staring at me with those pale blue eyes that always made me feel like she could see right through me. She didn't apologize, didn't take it back, didn't even look sorry. If anything, she looked satisfied, like she'd been waiting years to finally say it out loud. We left early, of course. David apologized the whole drive home, his knuckles white against the steering wheel as he navigated the familiar streets of our neighborhood. He kept saying his mother was stressed about her father's estate, that she didn't mean it, that she was just taking it out on me because I was an easy target. I nodded and made the right sounds, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. That night, lying in our bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed every interaction I'd ever had with Linda. The way she'd scrutinize our grocery receipts when she came to visit. How she'd ask pointed questions about our savings account, our credit cards, our future plans. I'd always assumed it was normal mother-in-law nosiness, but now I was starting to wonder if she'd been building a case against me all along. What evidence did she think she had? The next few days passed in a strange, uncomfortable haze. David tried to act normal, but I could tell he was troubled too. He'd catch me staring off into space and ask if I was okay, and I'd lie and say yes because what else could I do? The accusation hung between us like smoke, invisible but impossible to ignore. I found myself second-guessing every purchase, every decision, wondering if somehow I really had been using him without realizing it. Then Wednesday morning happened. I was getting ready for work, rushing around trying to find my other earring, when my phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar, and normally I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. Mrs. Patterson, the voice said, professional and polite. This is Janet from First National Bank. We need to discuss some unusual activity on your joint account. Could you come in today? My stomach dropped like a stone. Unusual activity could mean so many things: fraud, identity theft, or worse. I told Janet I'd be there within the hour and called in sick to work. David was already at the office, probably in meetings until lunch, so I didn't want to worry him until I knew what we were dealing with. As I drove to the bank, my mind raced through every possible scenario, none of them good. Janet was a kind-looking woman in her 50s with silver hair and warm brown eyes that immediately put me at ease. She led me into a small office and closed the door, then pulled out a thick folder with my name on it. I want to assure you that you're not in any trouble, she said, which somehow made me feel like I was in trouble. But we've noticed some patterns in your account that we're required to report, and I thought you should know. She opened the folder and showed me printouts of bank statements going back 6 months. At first glance, everything looked normal. My paycheck deposits, David's deposits, our mortgage payment, utilities, the usual stuff. But then Janet pointed to a series of withdrawals I'd never seen before, each one for exactly $500, happening every 2 weeks like clockwork. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had no idea what these were. "Do you recognize these transactions?" Janet asked gently, her finger tracing down the list of withdrawals. I shook my head, feeling dizzy and confused. "They're all cash withdrawals from the branch on Maple Street. The signature matches what we have on file for David Patterson, but the timing is unusual. They always happen on weekdays when you're typically at work." Something cold settled in my stomach as the implications began to sink in. I stared at those numbers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. $500, twice a month, for 6 months straight. That was $6,000 David had been taking out of our account without telling me. The same account we'd been trying to build up for our house down payment. The same savings I'd been contributing to with overtime shifts and freelance work on weekends. My hands started to shake. "There's something else," Janet said, and I braced myself because apparently this day could still get worse. "These cash withdrawals always happen within an hour of deposits from Linda Patterson. Same amount, same timing. It looks like money is being moved from her account to yours, then immediately withdrawn as cash." The room felt like it was spinning. Linda had been putting money into our account, and David had been taking it right back out. I sat there in that small bank office, trying to process what this meant. Had David been secretly taking money from his mother? Had Linda been giving it to him without my knowledge? And why cash? Why the secrecy? The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd stepped into someone else's life by mistake. All I could think about was Linda's accusation at dinner, delivered with such conviction. Had she known about these transactions when she called me a gold digger? Janet printed out copies of everything for me and explained that they'd flagged it because of the pattern and the amounts. "We're required to report regular cash transactions over a certain threshold," she said, sliding the papers across her desk. "But I thought you should be aware before we filed our report. This could be completely innocent, but..." She trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air between us. I thanked Janet and stumbled out of the bank, clutching the papers like they might disappear if I didn't hold them tight enough. My car felt like a safe haven, and I sat there in the parking lot for a long time, reading through the statements over and over. The dates, the amounts, the timing, it was all so methodical, so planned. This wasn't some spontaneous thing. This was a system that had been in place for months. The drive home was a blur of traffic lights and familiar turns that suddenly felt foreign. I kept thinking about all the times David had suggested we eat out instead of cooking, or said we should wait another month before making our house down payment. Had he been stalling because he knew our savings weren't really ours? The thought made me feel sick, and I had to pull over twice to catch my breath. When I finally made it home, I spread all the bank statements out on our kitchen table like evidence in a crime scene. But this wasn't about crime, this was about trust, about the life we'd built together, about everything I thought I knew about the man I married. I picked up my phone to call David, then put it down again. What would I even say? "Honey, why have you been secretly moving your mother's money through our account?" I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down at that table, staring at the numbers until they started to blur together. $6,000. That was real money, money that could have gone toward our future, our dreams, our life together. Instead, it had been some kind of elaborate shell game between David and his mother, with me as the unwitting middle person. The betrayal felt different than Linda's accusation, deeper somehow, because it came from the person I trusted most. The front door opened around 5:30, and I heard David's keys hit the bowl by the entrance, his briefcase thump onto the floor. "Hey babe," he called out, his voice cheerful and normal, like this was just another ordinary Wednesday. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, just sat there at the table with all those papers spread out in front of me like a roadmap to everything I didn't understand. His footsteps slowed as he approached the kitchen, and I heard the exact moment he saw what I was looking at. The sharp intake of breath, the pause, the soft "oh" that escaped his lips. I finally looked up at him, this man I'd loved for 3 years, married for 2, and saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not guilt, exactly, but something close to it. Something that made me wonder what else I didn't know. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. David nodded and pulled out the chair across from me, the same chair he'd sat in every morning for 2 years, drinking his coffee and reading the news on his phone. Now he looked at me across that familiar table like we were strangers, and I realized that maybe we were. The question that had been burning in my chest all afternoon finally made its way to my lips. "What is all this money about?" David's shoulders sagged like someone had let all the air out of him. He looked at the bank statements spread across our table, then back at me, and I could see him calculating what to say, how to explain what couldn't really be explained. "It's not what you think," he started, which is exactly what someone says when it's probably worse than what you think. I waited, my coffee growing cold in my hands, wondering how many more surprises this day had in store. "My mom's been giving me money," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not for us, exactly. For her. She needed me to move it around for tax reasons. Something about her dad's estate and the inheritance laws." He rubbed his forehead like he had a headache coming on. "She said if it stayed in her account too long, it would complicate the probate stuff." I thought I was helping. His explanation felt thin, like tissue paper in the rain. I stared at him across our kitchen table, this space where we'd shared thousands of meals, planned our future, laughed until our sides hurt. Now it felt like we were on opposite sides of a canyon. "Tax reasons," I repeated, tasting the words. "David, that's $6,000. You've been moving $6,000 through our account without telling me?" The hurt in my voice surprised even me, raw and sharp like a fresh cut. "I know how it looks," he said, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "But Bailey, I swear, I never touched that money. It went straight from her account to ours, then straight back to her in cash. I was like a middleman." He paused, studying my face. "She said she couldn't do the cash withdrawals herself because it would create a paper trail that might mess up the inheritance distribution." I thought I was protecting her. Something about his tone made me want to believe him, but the numbers didn't lie. "Protecting her from what, exactly?" I asked, pulling one of the statements closer. "And why didn't you tell me?" "We're married, David. We're supposed to make financial decisions together." The betrayal felt like a physical weight in my chest. Not because he'd taken the money, I believed him about that, but because he'd kept it secret. Because for 6 months, he'd been living a lie, and I'd been living in it without knowing. David looked down at his hands, and I could see him struggling with something. "Because she asked me not to," he said finally. "She said if too many people knew about the money movements, it could complicate things legally. She said she was trying to protect all of us from potential problems down the road." He glanced up at me with those brown eyes I'd fallen in love with. I thought I was doing the right thing. The word right hung between us like a question mark. "When did this start?" I asked, flipping through the statements to find the first transaction. "Because according to this, it's been going on since March." I found the date and showed it to him. March 15th, the first $500 deposit from Linda, followed an hour later by David's withdrawal. "That's right after your grandfather died." A cold realization started forming in my mind about the timing of everything. "Yeah," David nodded slowly. "That's when Mom started dealing with Grandpa's estate. She said there were all these complicated tax implications, and the lawyer told her to be careful about how she handled large sums of money." He reached across the table like he wanted to touch my hand, then thought better of it. "Bailey, I know I should have told you, but she made it sound so temporary. Like it would just be a few weeks while they sorted everything out." I thought about Linda's accusation at dinner, how rehearsed it had sounded, how certain she'd been. "David," I said slowly, pieces clicking together in my mind, "when your mom said I was using you for money, did she know you'd been helping her move cash around?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. His face went pale, and I knew I'd hit something important. Maybe," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "She's been stressed about the whole estate thing. Her brothers are giving her grief about how she's handling the distribution, and I think she's just lashing out." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "But Bailey, that accusation had nothing to do with this money stuff. She was talking about other things." "What other things?" I wondered. "What other things?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. David shifted in his chair, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "She thinks you married me too quickly after we met. She thinks you saw the family money and made a play for it." The words hit me like slaps. "I've tried to tell her that's not true, that you didn't even know about Grandpa's money when we got engaged, but she's got this idea stuck in her head." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the full picture started forming. "So she's been testing me somehow? Moving money through our account to see what I'd do with it?" The thought made me feel sick. "David, has your mother been using our marriage, our bank account, as some kind of elaborate trap?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. "I don't think she planned it that way," David said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "At least, not at first. The money thing really was about the estate taxes, I'm sure of it. He paused, running his hands through his hair. But maybe when she realized I wasn't telling you about it, she thought that proved something about our relationship. The betrayal felt deeper now, layered and complex. I stood up from the table, needing to move, to think, to process what I was learning. So let me get this straight, I said, pacing to the window and back. Your mother has been putting money into our account for months. You've been secretly taking it out as cash. And somehow this whole arrangement convinced her that I'm a gold digger? The absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't destroying my life. When you put it like that, it sounds crazy, David admitted. But Bailey, you have to understand, she's been dealing with my uncle's questioning every decision she makes about Grandpa's estate. She's paranoid about money right now, about people's motivation. He looked up at me with pleading eyes. I thought if I just helped her with this one thing, quietly, she'd eventually see how wrong she was about you. Instead, she'd used it as ammunition. I stopped pacing and looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find the man I'd married in this stranger who'd been keeping secrets. How much money are we talking about total? I asked. Not just the cash withdrawals, but the whole estate. How much money is your mother actually dealing with? The question felt important, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I needed to understand what was really at stake here. David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him debating how much to tell me. A lot, he said finally. Grandpa owned rental properties, had investments, life insurance. The whole estate is probably worth close to $2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2 million. No wonder Linda was paranoid. No wonder she'd been watching me so carefully all these months. And your mother controls all of it? I asked, sinking back into my chair. The math was starting to make sense now, the careful scrutiny, the pointed questions about our finances. David, does she think I somehow knew about this money when we got married? The thought made my cheeks burn with shame, even though I'd done nothing wrong. I don't know what she thinks anymore, David said, and for the first time, he sounded truly defeated. She's been different since Grandpa died, more suspicious, more controlling. It's like she thinks everyone is trying to take advantage of her. He looked at the bank statements scattered across our table. Maybe helping her with this money stuff was a mistake. Maybe it just made everything worse. The understatement of the year, I thought. David, I said, choosing my words carefully, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about the money, or your mother's accusations, or even the fact that you kept this secret from me. I paused, making sure he was really listening. This is about trust, about partnership, about whether we're actually building a life together or whether I'm just along for the ride. The truth of it settled between us like a challenge. He reached across the table and this time, I let him take my hand. His fingers were cold and slightly trembling. You're not along for the ride, he said firmly. Bailey, you're the most important thing in my life. I know I screwed up by not telling you about the money transfers, but I was trying to protect you from Mom's paranoia. His thumb traced small circles on my palm. I never thought it would backfire like this. But it did backfire, I said gently, not pulling my hand away but not squeezing back either. And now I'm sitting here wondering what else you haven't told me. What other family secrets are you protecting me from? The question hung between us like a bridge we both needed to cross. David, if we're going to get through this, I need to know everything. No more secrets, no more protecting me from your family's drama. He nodded slowly, and I could see something shift in his face, a decision being made. There's more, he said quietly. About Mom, about the estate, about why she's really been so suspicious of you. My heart sank because of course there was more. She thinks someone in the family has been stealing from Grandpa's accounts before he died. She thinks maybe she married the wrong person. The confession hung in the air like smoke, and I realized we'd barely scratched the surface. I squeezed his hand finally, not because I'd forgiven him, but because I could see how much this was hurting him too. Tell me everything, I said. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Because if Linda thought someone had been stealing from her father, and if she thought I was somehow involved, then this whole situation was about to get a lot more complicated than secret bank transfers and hurt feelings. David took a deep breath and began to talk, and I settled in to learn exactly how deep this family drama really went. Outside, the sun was setting, painting our kitchen in shades of gold and amber. But all I could think about was how quickly everything I thought I knew about my life had started to unravel. What else was coming? David stared at our joined hands for a moment before he started talking, like he was gathering courage from the contact. Mom found some bank statements in Grandpa's things after he died, he said slowly. Large cash withdrawals, always on the days when Uncle Jake visited him at the nursing home. His voice was barely above a whisper. She thinks Jake was manipulating Grandpa into giving him money, maybe even forging signatures. We're talking about $50,000 over the past 2 years. My stomach dropped. Jake was David's youngest uncle, the one who'd always seemed a little too friendly, a little too interested in everyone's business at family gatherings. I'd never liked him much, but I'd chalked it up to personality differences. Does she have proof? I asked, though I was starting to understand why Linda had been so paranoid about money, why she'd been watching everyone so carefully. If someone had been stealing from her dying father, her suspicion made more sense. That's the problem, David said, running his free hand through his hair. The nursing home says Grandpa was lucid when he made those withdrawals. He signed all the paperwork himself. But Mom thinks Jake was pressuring him, maybe even threatening to stop visiting if he didn't hand over cash. He paused, looking troubled. Grandpa was so lonely those last months. If Jake said he needed money for emergencies, Grandpa probably would have given him everything just to keep him coming around. I thought about Linda at the funeral, how she'd watched Jake like a hawk, how tense she'd gotten whenever he talked about how much he'd miss the old man. At the time, I'd assumed it was normal grief behavior, but now it felt more sinister. So when she accused me of using you for money, I said slowly, she was thinking about Jake, seeing patterns where maybe there weren't any. The pieces were starting to fit together in an ugly way. I think so, David nodded. She's convinced that people target our family for money, and when she saw how quickly we got engaged after meeting. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. I tried to explain that you didn't know anything about Grandpa's money back then, but she said that's exactly what someone smart would do. Keep it subtle, play the long game. The accusation stung even though I knew it wasn't true. And the secret money transfers, I said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise, those just confirmed her worst fears about me. I could see it now, how Linda's mind had worked. Her daughter-in-law didn't seem to notice or care about thousands of dollars moving through her bank account, which either meant I was incredibly naive or incredibly calculating. Either way, it probably looked suspicious to a woman already burned by financial betrayal. David squeezed my hand tighter. I never thought about it like that, he said. I just thought if I could help her move the money quietly, without involving you in the estate drama, she'd eventually realize you weren't like Jake. His intentions had been good, but the execution had been disastrous. Instead, I accidentally made you look exactly like what she was afraid of. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't ruining my marriage. What else is she afraid of? I asked, because clearly there were more layers to this family dysfunction than I'd realized. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. David, if we're doing this, we're doing it all the way. No more protecting me from the truth. I needed to understand what I was really dealing with if I had any hope of fixing this. She thinks Jake might try to contest the will, he said quietly. He's been asking questions about the estate distribution, wanting to see paperwork, claiming Grandpa promised him more money than what's actually in the will. David's voice got tighter as he talked. Mom's been preparing for a legal fight, and she's terrified that if there's any evidence of financial irregularities in the family, it could hurt her case, including secret cash transfers through her son's bank account. The full picture was finally coming into focus, and it wasn't pretty. Linda hadn't just been paranoid about gold diggers, she'd been protecting herself from a potential lawsuit while simultaneously trying to figure out who in the family she could trust. So when she saw our bank statements, I said slowly, she probably thought she'd found another person trying to steal from the family. No wonder she'd been so hostile. Maybe, David said. Or maybe she thought you and I were working together somehow, using our marriage to hide money movements. The suggestion made me feel sick. Bailey, I know how paranoid this all sounds, but Mom's been dealing with lawyers for months. They've told her to be suspicious of everything, to assume the worst about everyone's motivations. Legal advice that had poisoned her relationship with her own family. I stood up again, needing to move, to think. David, do you realize what this means? I asked, pacing to the kitchen window. Your mother has been treating me like a criminal for months, not because of anything I actually did, but because of her fears about Jake and her lawyer's advice to trust no one. The unfairness of it made me want to scream, but I kept my voice steady. I know, he said miserably. And I made it worse by keeping the money transfers secret. If I'd just told you what was happening, you could have. He paused, realizing the problem. Actually, what would you have done? Told me not to help her? Made her find another way to move the money? It was a good question, and I wasn't sure I knew the answer. I would have understood, I said, turning back to face him. I would have known why she was watching me so carefully, why she asked so many questions about our finances. I sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted. Instead, I've been walking around for months thinking she just hated me for no reason, while she's been building a case against me in her head. The misunderstanding had fed on itself, growing stronger with each interaction. David looked at me across the table, and I could see years of family dysfunction written on his face. "What do we do now?" he asked. "How do we fix this?" It was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Because this wasn't just about Linda's suspicions or David's secrets. It was about whether our marriage could survive being built on a foundation of hidden truths. First, I said, "You're going to call your mother and tell her we know about the money transfers. No more secrets, no more protection." David started to protest, but I held up my hand. "She accused me of being a gold digger in front of your entire family. I think I've earned the right to defend myself with all the facts." He nodded reluctantly, clearly not looking forward to that conversation. "Second," I continued, "we're going to figure out exactly how much money is involved in this estate mess, and what Linda's legal situation actually is." I paused, choosing my words carefully. Because if Jake really was stealing from your grandfather, and if he's planning to contest the will, then we need to understand what we're all walking into. This family drama was bigger than just Linda's suspicions about me. And third, I said, meeting David's eyes directly, we're going to have a very serious conversation about trust and honesty in our marriage. My voice was steady, but I could feel tears threatening. Because I love you, but I can't live with a husband who keeps secrets from me, even good-intentioned ones. The admission hung between us like a bridge we'd both have to choose to cross. David nodded, and I could see him making the same choice I was making, to fight for this relationship instead of running from it. "I'll call Mom tonight," he said. "And Bailey, I promise, no more secrets. About anything." It was a start, though I knew rebuilding trust would take more than promises. It would take time, and patience, and probably more difficult conversations than either of us wanted to have. "Okay," I said, squeezing his hand one more time before standing up to start dinner. Because life had to go on, even when everything felt upside down. "But David?" I paused at the stove, looking back at him sitting there surrounded by bank statements. "When you call your mother, I want to be there. It's time I stopped being protected from your family's problems." If Linda and I were going to find a way forward, it had to start with honesty. David smiled for the first time all evening, and it reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Deal," he said. "No more protection, no more secrets." As I started pulling ingredients from the refrigerator, I found myself hoping that maybe, just maybe, this crisis could actually bring our family closer together. But first, we had some very difficult phone calls to make. Outside, the sun had finally set, leaving our kitchen bathed in the warm glow of overhead lights. It felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, though I wasn't sure yet whether the next part of the story would have a happy ending. What I did know was that I was tired of being kept in the dark about my own life. We waited until after dinner to make the call, both of us picking at our food like we were eating cardboard instead of the pasta I'd made 100 times before. David kept checking his phone, probably hoping Linda would somehow call first and save him from having to initiate this conversation. I understood the impulse, but we'd already waited 6 months too long to have this discussion. Every minute we postponed it felt like another small betrayal of the honesty we'd promised each other. "You sure you want to be here for this?" David asked as he pulled up Linda's contact information. His thumb hovered over her name like he was afraid to press it. "She's probably going to say some things that'll hurt to hear directly." I appreciated his concern, but I was done being shielded from uncomfortable truths. The protection had caused more damage than any harsh words ever could, and I needed Linda to see me as a person, not a problem to be managed from a distance. "I'm sure," I said, settling into the couch beside him. "Put it on speaker." David took a deep breath and hit call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and I found myself hoping she wouldn't answer. But then her familiar voice filled our living room, crisp and professional even at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. "David? Is everything all right?" Because of course she'd assumed something was wrong, we never called her after dinner. "Hi Mom," David said, glancing at me for support. "Bailey and I need to talk to you about something. We're both here, and you're on speaker." There was a pause, and I could practically hear Linda's mental calculations through the phone. She was probably wondering if this was about her accusation at dinner, if I'd finally convinced David to choose sides. The silence stretched uncomfortably until she cleared her throat and said, I see. What's this about? It's about the money transfers, David said, ripping the band-aid off quickly. The ones you've been making into our account, and the cash withdrawals I've been doing for you. Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear what sounded like a television being turned off in the background. When Linda spoke again, her voice was different, guarded and careful. I'm not sure what you mean, David. But she knew exactly what he meant. Mom, the bank called Bailey in today, David continued, his voice gaining strength. They flagged the pattern of deposits and withdrawals as unusual activity. She knows about the money movements, and she knows I've been helping you without telling her. I watched his face as he talked, seeing him choose transparency over protection in real time. We need to clear the air about what's been happening and why. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Linda was quiet for so long I thought the call might have dropped. Then she sighed, a sound so deep it seemed to come from somewhere beyond exhaustion. I suppose this was always going to come out eventually, she said, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded vulnerable. Bailey, I owe you an explanation. The acknowledgement surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness, not this subdued acceptance of responsibility. Yes, you do, I said, finding my voice. You accused me of using David for money in front of your entire family, while secretly moving thousands of dollars through our bank account. I kept my tone level, but I couldn't hide the hurt completely. I've been walking around for months thinking you hated me, when really you were testing me somehow. The confession felt like lancing a wound, painful but necessary. I wasn't testing you, Linda said quickly. At least, not intentionally. She paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. But when David told me he was helping with the money transfers, and you never mentioned them, never seemed to notice. She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. It seemed convenient that you were so uninvolved with your own bank account. The accusation stung because I could see her logic. Because David didn't tell me, I said firmly. He was trying to protect me from family drama, which means I couldn't notice something I didn't know was happening. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Linda's test had been flawed from the beginning because it was based on information I'd never been given. If you wanted to know who I really was, you should have been honest with me instead of watching me like a suspect. Linda sighed again, and when she spoke, some of the stiffness had left her voice. You're right, she said simply. I've been paranoid since Dad died. When we found evidence that Jake had been taking money from him, I started seeing threats everywhere. The admission felt like a crack in the wall she'd built between us. My lawyers told me to be suspicious of everyone's financial motivations, and I let that poison how I saw you. Tell her about the will contest, David said quietly, squeezing my hand. Linda made a small noise of protest, but David continued. Bailey needs to understand what we're really dealing with. There was another pause, and I could practically feel Linda weighing how much to reveal. The family secrets were like nesting dolls, each one containing another layer of complexity I hadn't known existed. Jake is planning to challenge the will, Linda said finally. He's hired a lawyer, and they're claiming that I manipulated Dad into leaving me as executor. Her voice got tighter as she continued. They're saying I isolated him from the family, that I influenced his financial decisions for my own benefit. The accusation was clearly painful for her to repeat, and I found myself feeling sympathy for a woman I'd thought hated me an hour ago. Is that why you needed the money transfers? I asked, pieces clicking together. To show that you weren't keeping everything for yourself? Linda's pause told me I'd hit on something important. You've been moving money through our account to create a paper trail that shows you distributing assets to family members. It was actually clever, if ethically questionable, and I could see why she'd wanted to keep it quiet. Partly, Linda admitted. My lawyer said it would be good to show a pattern of sharing resources with David, especially since Jake's lawyer is claiming I cut the family off from Dad's money. She paused again, and I could hear her breathing. But honestly, Bailey, I also wanted to see how you'd react to having extra money in your account. I needed to know if you were, like Jake. The comparison made my skin crawl. I never saw the money because David never told me about it, I repeated, frustration creeping into my voice. And even if I had seen it, I would have asked questions instead of just helping myself to it. The whole situation felt like a horrible comedy of errors, built on assumptions and secrets that had snowballed into family-destroying accusations. Linda, did it ever occur to you to just talk to me directly? No, she said quietly. Because if you were like Jake, you would have lied. The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. And if you weren't like Jake, then I was putting you in the middle of an ugly family fight for no reason." She paused, and when she continued, she sounded older somehow. "I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping you out of it. I see now that I was just creating more problems." I looked at David, seeing my own thoughts reflected in his face. This whole mess could have been avoided with a single honest conversation months ago. "Linda," I said carefully, "I understand why you were scared after what happened with Jake. But testing people in secret, watching them for signs of betrayal, that's not protection. That's paranoia." The word hung between us like a diagnosis neither of us wanted to acknowledge. "You're right," Linda said, and the admission sounded like it cost her something. "I've been so focused on protecting Dad's legacy from Jake that I forgot how to trust anyone else." There was a long pause, filled with what felt like years of misunderstanding finally being acknowledged. "Bailey, I owe you an apology. A real one, not just for the accusation at dinner, but for months of treating you like a threat instead of family." The apology should have felt better than it did. Instead, it left me feeling hollow, like we'd all wasted so much time and energy on a problem that didn't need to exist. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "But Linda, where do we go from here? Because I can't pretend the last 6 months didn't happen." The hurt was still there, sitting in my chest like a stone, and forgiveness felt like something that would take time to grow. "I don't know," Linda said honestly. "But I'd like to try to do better. To be better." Her voice was softer now, more like the woman I'd glimpsed occasionally at family gatherings before suspicion had hardened her heart. "Maybe we could start by having dinner again, just the 3 of us this time. Without accusations or hidden agendas." The suggestion felt like a small olive branch, tentatively offered. I looked at David, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," I said. "But this time, we all come to the table honestly. No more secrets, no more tests, no more protecting each other from the truth." It felt like a reasonable request, though I knew changing family dynamics would be harder than just agreeing to try. "And Linda? I want to help with Jake's legal challenge, if you'll let me." "Why?" she asked, surprise clear in her voice. "This isn't your fight, Bailey." But it was my fight now, because these people were my family, whether the relationships were perfect or not. "Because Jake hurt someone I care about," I said simply. "And because I want to prove that not everyone in your life is trying to take advantage of you." The offer seemed to surprise her, and maybe it surprised me too. When we finally hung up 20 minutes later, I felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The conversation hadn't fixed everything. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it does to break, but it had cleared the air in a way that felt like progress. David pulled me close on the couch, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, both processing what had just happened between his family and ours. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in Linda's kitchen, helping her prepare dinner for the first time since I'd married her son. She'd invited us over with what felt like genuine warmth rather than obligation, and I'd accepted despite the nervous flutter in my stomach. We were both trying, which felt like progress even if the conversation still had careful edges. "Could you check the roast?" she asked, handing me a meat thermometer like this was the most natural thing in the world. The dinner was nothing like that disastrous birthday meal where everything had exploded. This time, when Linda asked about our finances, it was with real interest rather than suspicion. She wanted to know about my freelance writing work, about the house we were saving for, about our actual dreams instead of looking for evidence of hidden motives. David watched us interact with barely concealed relief, probably still amazed that we were managing civil conversation after everything that had happened. "Jake's lawyer filed their official challenge last week," Linda said as we sat down to eat. "But my attorney thinks we have a strong case." She looked directly at me when she said it, including me in family business instead of tiptoeing around it. "The nursing home records show that Dad was mentally competent when he made those withdrawals, but there's clear evidence of emotional manipulation." It felt strange to be trusted with these details after being excluded for so long. "What kind of evidence?" I asked, genuinely curious. Linda had started showing me the paperwork she'd been collecting, treating me like an ally instead of a threat. "Text messages, mostly," she said, cutting into her roast. "Jake would send Dad photos of his bills, sob stories about needing money for car repairs or medical emergencies that never quite added up. The manipulation was more systematic than I'd realized, and my sympathy for Linda's paranoia grew deeper. David reached for my hand under the table, a gesture that felt natural now instead of desperate. We'd been rebuilding our trust slowly, one honest conversation at a time. "Bailey had a good idea about the financial records," he said to his mother. Tell her about the timeline you put together. I'd suggested organizing everything chronologically to show the pattern of Jake's requests, and Linda had been surprisingly receptive to input from someone she'd considered an outsider just weeks ago. It's brilliant, actually, Linda said, and I could hear genuine appreciation in her voice. We can show that every time Jake visited, Dad withdrew exactly the amount Jake had claimed to need in his messages the day before. She paused to take a bite, then continued. No legitimate family loans follow that kind of pattern. It proves premeditation. The evidence was damning when laid out properly, and I felt satisfied knowing I'd contributed something useful to the defense. After dinner, while David loaded the dishwasher, Linda and I found ourselves alone in her living room for the first time ever. She poured us both tea and settled into the chair across from me, studying my face like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. I owe you more than an apology, she said quietly. I owe you acknowledgement that I was wrong about who you are. The words felt carefully chosen, like she'd been practicing them. You were scared, I said, because understanding her motivations had made forgiveness easier. Jake betrayed your father's trust, and you were trying to protect what was left of the family. I sipped my tea, choosing my next words carefully. But Linda, fear makes us see threats that aren't there. I was never your enemy. The conversation felt like closing a chapter neither of us had enjoyed living through, but both of us had learned from. I know that now, she said, setting down her teacup with a soft clink. You could have walked away from this whole mess, told David to choose between his paranoid mother and his wife. She paused, meeting my eyes. Instead, you've been more supportive of this family than some actual family members. The comparison to Jake was implicit but clear, and it felt like recognition I hadn't realized I'd been craving. This is my family too, I said simply. For better or worse, we're stuck with each other. The joke made Linda smile, the first genuinely relaxed expression I'd ever seen on her face in my presence. Besides, I'm stubborn. When someone tells me I don't belong somewhere, it makes me want to prove them wrong. The admission made us both laugh, breaking some invisible tension that had been holding us apart. David appeared in the doorway, tea towel still in his hands, and I could see the relief on his face as he watched his mother and wife actually enjoying each other's company. Everything okay in here? He asked, though he could clearly see that it was. More than okay, Linda said. Bailey and I were just discussing how stubborn we both are. The inclusive we felt like a gift neither David nor I had expected to receive. On the drive home, David was quieter than usual, but it was a peaceful quiet rather than the tense silence that had characterized too many of our recent car rides. Thank you, he said finally as we pulled into our driveway. For giving her another chance. For giving us another chance. The gratitude in his voice reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him, and why I'd been willing to fight for this relationship instead of running from its complications. Thank you for finally trusting me with the truth, I replied, squeezing his hand as we sat in our dark garage. All of it, even the ugly parts. The honesty between us felt different now, more intentional and less accidental. We'd both learned that protecting each other from difficult realities wasn't actually protection at all. It was just another form of isolation that served no one well. 2 months later, Jake's legal challenge collapsed when his own text messages were entered into evidence. Linda had been right about the pattern of manipulation, and the court saw through Jake's claims of family alienation pretty quickly. Justice served, David said when he got off the phone with Linda's lawyer, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. Even corrupt family members leave holes when they're finally cut away completely from your life. Linda had asked me to be there when she distributed the inheritance checks to the legitimate family members. I want them to see that this family includes people who can be trusted, she'd said, and the inclusion felt like an honor I'd earned rather than something owed to me. Standing in that lawyer's office, watching Linda methodically right her father's wrongs, I felt like I'd finally found my place in this complicated family structure. David and I used our inheritance check as the down payment on our house, something that would have felt impossible during those dark weeks when secrets were poisoning everything. Linda insisted on coming to the closing, bringing flowers for our new home and tears of pride that surprised all three of us. Dad would have loved seeing this, she said as we stood in our empty living room, and I believed her. The house hunting had been different this time around, with Linda offering advice instead of suspicious questions about our budget. She'd even driven around with us one Saturday, pointing out neighborhood pros and cons like any normal mother-in-law helping her kids make a major decision. The transformation felt miraculous, though I knew it had taken work from all three of us to make it possible. 6 months after that terrible dinner where everything had fallen apart, we hosted Linda for Thanksgiving in our new dining room. The conversation flowed naturally now, seasoned with inside jokes and shared memories instead of careful politeness. When Linda asked about our 5-year plans, it was because she wanted to be part of them, not because she was looking for evidence against me. The difference felt like breathing clean air after months of smog. I've been thinking about what Jake taught all of us, Linda said over dessert, her voice thoughtful rather than bitter. Not intentionally, obviously, but... She paused, gathering her thoughts. He showed me that suspicion destroys relationships faster than any actual betrayal could. I almost lost both of you because I was so afraid of being fooled again. The insight felt hard-won, born from experience rather than theory. You didn't lose us, David said firmly. We're all still here, still figuring it out together. He looked around our table. At his mother and his wife sharing pie, and conversation like this had always been natural. Maybe we needed to go through something difficult to learn how to really trust each other. The optimism in his voice felt earned rather than forced, grounded in evidence rather than hope alone. Later that night, after Linda had gone home and we were cleaning up our kitchen together, I found myself thinking about how much had changed since that phone call from the bank. The woman who'd answered that call had been living half a life, protected from truths that might have prepared her better for the complications of loving this family. Now I felt like a full participant rather than a grateful guest. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the bank hadn't called? David asked, loading the last of the dishes into the dishwasher. It was a good question, and not one with a comfortable answer. We probably would have limped along for years, I said honestly. You keeping secrets, your mother building resentment, me wondering why I always felt like an outsider. The alternative timeline felt sad and inevitable. I'm glad they called, I said finally, meaning it despite everything we'd been through. I'm glad we had to face all of this head-on instead of pretending it wasn't happening. The crisis had been painful, but it had also been clarifying in ways that might have taken years to achieve otherwise. Sometimes the hard conversations really were the most necessary ones, even when they felt impossible to start. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I felt grateful for this complicated family I'd accidentally married into. This house we'd bought with money from a grandfather I'd barely known. This life we'd built from a foundation that had cracked and then been carefully repaired. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest now, and that felt like everything.